The nature of changing rooms in public spaces, such as pools and gyms, has become a topic of growing concern in recent years, stirring debates about who should be allowed in these spaces. While these discussions can often become heated and political, one individual's personal experience highlights a situation where the safety and comfort of changing rooms were severely compromised, an experience that still lingers in their memory today. This story, though not a commentary on the ongoing debates, illustrates a moment where all societal norms, regulations, and expectations were disregarded in a sudden, terrifying instance. The narrator begins by recalling their post-pandemic journey to get fit again, a goal they had committed to with fervor. They frequented the local pool 3 times a week, adhering to a strict routine of swimming and dieting, and had seen tangible improvements in their fitness. As a female member of a gym and pool complex, the narrator often changed in the female locker room, a place where, on one particular day, they and some friends had gathered before a swim. This was a regular routine, as they had begun coordinating their workout schedules to support each other, making the experience more enjoyable. On this particular day, an elderly woman who was not a regular at the gym was also present, adding to the otherwise familiar atmosphere. However, things quickly took a terrifying turn when the group of friends heard strange noises from outside the changing room. There was scuffling, loud bangs, and muffled shouting, a chaotic sound that no one could immediately explain. Frozen in place, the narrator and her friends were left unsure of what was happening just outside. Suddenly, a man burst into the locker room, and his appearance was nothing short of terrifying. He was disheveled, wearing filthy blue shorts and a stained white t-shirt. His wild hair and unkempt appearance suggested something deeply wrong, but the real shock came when they noticed he was holding a large rusty machete. His skin was blotchy and covered in cuts and bruises, and there were foam flecks at the corners of his mouth. The atmosphere was charged with fear, and his sudden appearance left the group paralyzed with shock. In that moment, the man let out a guttural, animal-like scream and charged at the group, the machete in his hand trembling as he advanced. While the narrator wished to be brave and confront the man, their instinct took over. They screamed at the top of their lungs and fell back against the lockers, paralyzed by fear. It was only moments later that armed police officers followed the man into the locker room, yelling for him to stop. In a blur of activity, the man fled through the locker room and into the pool area, with the officers chasing after him. The group of friends, still reeling from the shock, stood in silence, too frightened to move. The elderly woman, who had been shoved by the man during his escape, was in tears, but fortunately unharmed. The situation outside continued to escalate as more screams, shouts, and even a gunshot echoed from the pool area. The noise gradually subsided, but the tension lingered. Eventually, a police officer entered the locker room and assured everyone that it was safe to leave. By the time the group made their way to the front desk, the man who had caused the chaos was seen being escorted to a police car. It turned out that he had been threatening people with the machete on the street before running into the gym and bursting into the women's locker room. Although it was unclear whether he had intended to harm anyone in the locker room, the fact that no one was injured was a relief. Reflecting on the terrifying experience, the narrator expresses gratitude that the situation did not escalate further, and they are relieved that no one was taken hostage. The man was presumably under the influence of drugs, possibly bath salts, which would explain his erratic and dangerous behavior. Although the incident left them shaken, it became a strange point of notoriety at the gym, and the group of women who had been in the locker room that day were even given special treatment, treated like celebrities for their brush with danger. Despite the man's arrest, the narrator continues to be haunted by the memory of the madman's face and the trauma of that day. Even years later, they saw someone who resembled him working at a Wendy's, raising the unsettling possibility that the man might be out of prison and living among the public again. Though they tried to move on, the fear of that moment remains a part of their life, always lurking in the background. This harrowing story serves as a reminder of how vulnerable we can be, even in places we consider safe. It also underscores the importance of staying vigilant, as danger can sometimes appear when we least expect it. These days, there's a lot of panic surrounding the idea of who should or shouldn't be allowed in public changing rooms at pools and gyms. It's a hotly debated topic, with some people pushing for regulations on who can use these spaces, while others think the concerns are exaggerated. The narrator of this story, however, doesn't engage in the political discourse around it. Instead, she shares a deeply unsettling personal experience that occurred in a changing room where all rules and social norms seemed to disappear, leaving her terrified. This event happened while she was pursuing a post-pandemic fitness journey, going to the pool 3 times a week. Her routine was going well, with a solid diet and consistent workouts, and she was proud of her commitment. At the time, she was a member of a gym and pool complex where she often exercised with a small group of friends she had met at the gym. The group would coordinate their workout and swim 20 times to support and pace each other. On this particular day, as the group prepared for a swim session, they were in the women's changing room when something disturbing began to unfold. Among them was an elderly woman whom the narrator hadn't seen before. Everything seemed normal at first, but suddenly the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of a scuffle, loud bangs, and incoherent shouting from outside the dressing room made everyone freeze in place. As the group looked at each other in shock, a man stormed into the changing room. The sight of him was something the narrator would never forget. He was dressed in filthy clothes with his hair wild and disheveled. His skin was blotchy and flaky, covered in cuts and bruises, and his eyes were wild with a crazed look. What was most terrifying, though, was the large machete he held in his hands, rusted, grimy, and looking as though it had been through something terrible. It wasn't even sharp, but it was absolutely terrifying to see in that setting. For a moment he paused when he saw the women in the changing room, and the narrator can still hear the horrifying scream he let out. It was animalistic, guttural, like something out of a nightmare. His grip on the machete trembled as he charged toward the narrator. In the panic, the narrator screamed at the top of her lungs, falling back against the lockers in pure shock. Just as the situation became unbearable, a group of armed police officers burst into the room, chasing the man and yelling for him to freeze. The man didn't stop. And instead, he bolted toward the showers and then onto the pool area, with the police hot on his heels. He even shoved the elderly woman toward the cops, sending her face first into one of them, though she wasn't badly hurt. The group of women, now frozen in terror, stood there in stunned silence. What had just happened? What was going on outside? The sounds of chaos from the pool area seemed to intensify, followed by more yelling and the ominous sound of a gunshot. The group remained in the dressing room, shaken, too scared to leave despite the noise dying down. A police officer came to inform them that it was safe to exit, but no one felt like swimming anymore. Instead, they got dressed quickly and left the gym, still in a state of disbelief. As they passed the front desk, the narrator saw the machete-wielding man, now in police custody, being escorted to a squad car. It turned out that he had been walking down the street earlier, threatening people with the machete, and had run into the gym, where he found himself in the women's locker room. While it was never clear if the man had intended to hurt anyone specifically, the narrator was incredibly grateful that no one was injured during the incident. The police had speculated that he was likely under the influence of bath salts or some other substance, which explained his erratic behavior. The whole event, though traumatic, didn't leave any lasting scars, and over time, it became somewhat of a legend at the gym. The narrator and her friends were even treated like celebrities by other gym members, who admired their survival story. As for the man, the narrator believes he was probably sent to jail, but she had a chilling realization sometime later that he might have been released. Years later, when the narrator was much older, she saw a man who looked strikingly similar to the one who had burst into the changing room, working at a local Wendy's. Though the man looked cleaner and healthier, the narrator couldn't shake the feeling that he might be the same person. It was a moment that triggered the haunting memories of that terrifying day in the locker room. The memory, though distant, still weighed on her mind, making her feel uneasy whenever she thought about it too much. Reflecting on this event, the narrator shared how it had affected her over the years. The feeling of helplessness, fear, and the constant vigilance about safety after that day had shaped her view of the world. While she had been able to move on with her life, she knew she would never forget the man's face or the fear she felt in that moment. The experience left her with a deep sense of awareness about the unpredictability of the world and the importance of always being alert, because you never know when someone might burst into your life with a weapon, ready to cause. The story begins with a chilling incident that took place in a seemingly normal setting, a public pool and gym. The narrator recounts a time when, while preparing for a swim session, an unexpected and frightening event unfolded in the female changing room. At the time, the narrator was part of a post-pandemic fitness routine, attending the pool 3 times a week to get back in shape. She had been consistent with her workouts, and it was a source of pride for her. Along with her friends, she had developed a camaraderie that made their gym sessions and swims feel more like a social event. They would time their swims to pace each other, which was a pleasant way to encourage each other to stick to their routines. On the day of the incident, everything seemed normal as they changed in the women's locker room. The group was preparing for their swim when they heard sounds that immediately indicated something was wrong. Loud bangs, shouts, and the noise of a struggle outside the dressing room. The moment was charged with tension, and everyone froze, unsure of what was happening. Looking toward the hallway that led around the corner from the dressing room, the group was shocked to see a man suddenly storm into the locker room. The narrator described him as a sight she would never forget. Dressed in dirty, ill-fitting clothes, his hair wild and disheveled, with cuts and bruises covering his skin. His eyes were crazed, and he was holding a machete. It was an alarming and frightening sight. His appearance and his manner made it clear that he was not well, both physically and mentally. As the man entered the room, he paused, locking eyes with the women. The narrator can still hear the terrifying sound he made, a guttural, animalistic scream that has seemed to emanate from the depths of his being. The machete trembled in his hand, and his presence was filled with violent intent. At that moment, the narrator's survival instincts kicked in. She screamed and tried to back away, but the man began charging toward her. Her first reaction wasn't bravery, instead it was sheer panic. She fell against the lockers in her haste, overwhelmed by the shock of what was happening. But just as the man neared, the sound of police officers entering the scene broke the tension. A group of armed officers entered the changing room, yelling for the man to stop. He was soon chased through the locker room, into the showers, and out toward the pool area. The officers followed, and the situation quickly escalated. The man's erratic behavior continued as he shoved an elderly woman into one of the officers. This act of aggression added to the confusion and chaos, as the group of women in the locker room could only watch, paralyzed by fear. The elderly woman was shaken up but unhurt, and after the police officer ensured her safety, the group of women remained in the dressing room, too scared to leave. Meanwhile, screams echoed from the pool area, followed by more shouting and even a gunshot. The group exchanged glances, unsure of what was going on, but knowing that something horrifying was taking place. It wasn't until a police officer came into the locker room to reassure them that it was safe to leave that they ventured out. Even then, no one felt like swimming. They were all too rattled by the experience. As they left the gym, heading toward the front desk, the narrator saw the machete-wielding man being escorted to a police car, now without his weapon. It turned out that the man had been causing a scene in the neighborhood, threatening people with the machete before running into the gym. While the police had not been sure whether he had intended to harm anyone in the locker room, they believed that he had been on a drug-induced rampage. The police speculated that the man was likely on bath salts, which explained his violent and erratic behavior. Though the incident was traumatic, no one was physically injured. The group of women was incredibly fortunate. However, the experience left them shaken, and it marked a turning point for the narrator. She became more cautious about her safety, especially in public places where she previously felt secure. A few days after the incident, as the narrator continued with her daily life, a strange encounter made the memory resurface. While she was out and about, she saw a man who looked eerily similar to the one who had stormed into the locker room. This man, although much healthier and cleaner, bore an uncanny resemblance to the violent individual. He was working at a local fast food restaurant, and the sight of him sent a shiver down the narrator's spine. The terrifying face of the man who had haunted her thoughts for days suddenly appeared before her again. She couldn't help but wonder whether he had been released from prison, and if it was the same person. The encounter left her disturbed, as the traumatic memory of that day in the locker room was forever imprinted in her mind. Reflecting on the incident, the narrator admitted that she would never forget the man's face or the terror she felt in the moment. Though time had passed, the event continued to haunt her, shaping her perspective on safety and the unpredictability of the world. She now lived with a heightened sense of awareness, constantly on edge, knowing that the next violent encounter could happen at any moment. Despite her ongoing life and routine, the incident remained a dark chapter she couldn't shake. And every time she saw someone who looked even remotely similar to that man, her heart would race. In conclusion, the experience in the locker room was a wake-up call for the narrator about the unpredictability of life and the real dangers that exist, even in places one would typically consider safe. The traumatic event left her with a lasting fear, but also a deep sense of gratitude that no one was physically harmed. It was a reminder that sometimes life can change in an instant, and the most ordinary moments can quickly spiral into chaos. The experience shared in the fourth summary presents an intense and frightening event that occurred during a seemingly ordinary day in school. The story begins with a narrator recounting a childhood friendship that began when they met a classmate named Clarky. From the beginning of their friendship, they were inseparable, spending nearly every day together. As young children, they were considered part of the popular group, always involved in mischievous activities that were harmless but fun. They had a close bond, and for a while everything seemed perfect. They were partners in crime, always in sync and never apart. However, the transition from primary school to secondary school was an enormous shock for them both, one that would have long-lasting consequences. In the UK, the school system involves a sudden jump from primary school to secondary school, where children as young as 11 are thrust into a much larger and more intimidating environment. This shift left both the narrator and Clarky feeling completely unprepared. Gone were the days of feeling like the kings of their small primary school. Now they were small fish in a much larger pond, surrounded by older students who seemed like towering giants in comparison. The once close duo found themselves separated, placed in different houses, which meant they no longer had any classes together. The separation intensified their feelings of isolation and loneliness. While they could still see each other during breaks and after school, the camaraderie they once shared began to fade. Their newfound unpopularity made them easy targets for bullies. One group of bullies tormented the narrator, while another group targeted Clarky. These bullies were relentless, making their school experience miserable and overwhelming. The pain of being constantly picked on took a toll on their mental well-being. Despite this, they kept their struggles to themselves as they feared that telling anyone would only make the situation worse. They were trapped in a cycle of fear and humiliation. The bullies, led by two particularly cruel boys named Jake and Jonah, were an ongoing source of torment. These two bullies would pick on the narrator and Clarky in cruel and inventive ways, often bullying them together but sometimes targeting them individually. Their tormentors took pleasure in making their lives difficult. Jake and Jonah would insult and physically harm them, often going out of their way to make their school days unbearable. It didn't matter whether the boys were together or apart, the bullying was constant. From cruel verbal insults to physical pranks, it seemed that there was no escaping the torment. The narrator and Clarky endured this every day, and as the school year went on, they became more withdrawn and defeated. It was a difficult and painful time for both of them. In addition to the bullying, they both struggled to make new friends, as the school had separated them from their primary school classmates. As time passed, their bullying experiences escalated. Jake and Jonah were particularly cruel, and their bullying became more frequent and intense. They would target the narrator and Clarky, picking on them for seemingly trivial reasons. The bullies would kick their shoes, pour glue into their school bags, or damage their belongings. The emotional and physical abuse took its toll, and the narrator began to feel like there was no way out. They suffered in silence, enduring the torment without seeking help from adults or teachers. The bullying seemed to be a part of their daily lives, and it felt like they would never escape it. Their school life was defined by fear and anxiety, and they became accustomed to the cruelty of their peers. Things took a tragic turn during the summer term of their first year at secondary school when they were introduced to the school pool. While the pool was a long-awaited source of excitement for many of the students, the narrator and Clarky felt little joy about it. They were still reeling from their earlier experiences of bullying, and the thought of using the pool only reminded them of their unpopularity. They were reluctant to join the other kids in the pool, but as time passed, they began to feel more comfortable with the idea. During one of the swimming lessons, the narrator and Clarky were left alone in the changing rooms, and their bond began to rekindle. They decided to return to the pool together, despite the consequences they could face for playing in the unsupervised area. Unfortunately, this lighthearted decision took a dark turn when Jake and Jonah appeared at the pool. The bullies, now fully dressed in their school uniforms, entered the pool area and immediately began taunting the two boys. Jonah, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in bullying Clarky, using cruel words and actions to torment him. This time, however, things went further than just verbal insults. Jonah and Jake, with their usual cruelty, began to make Clarky do something dangerous, pushing him to put his head in a drainage hole at the bottom of the pool. What followed was a tragic accident that would haunt the narrator for the rest of their life. Jonah shoved Clarky's head into the grate, and as Clarky struggled to free himself, his neck was twisted into an unnatural position. The sound of a crack echoed through the pool area, and immediately Clarky stopped moving. He had tragically broken his neck. The narrator was helpless, watching in horror as their best friend slowly drifted away in the water, unable to do anything to save him. The two bullies, realizing the severity of what had just happened, fled the scene, leaving the narrator alone with the lifeless body of his best friend. In the aftermath of this traumatic event, the narrator struggled with what to do. They ultimately decided to cover up the truth, believing that Jonah's remorseful reaction was enough to prevent his life from being ruined. However, the guilt and pain of losing Clarky never left the narrator. They carried the memory of that day for the rest of their life, feeling the weight of the decision they had made. The bullying had stopped after that tragic incident, but it had come at an unimaginable cost. The narrator was left with the knowledge that they had been unable to save their best friend, and the haunting memory of what had occurred in the pool would forever shape their life. The story begins with the narrator recounting an experience from their time attending a charter school in Minnesota during the early 1990s. The school, newly opened the year before the narrator was set to start, was housed in a converted mansion. The narrator recalls the building as being damp and musty, with a small student body. This environment made it feel somewhat isolated, and as a child, it was a bit unsettling. The school was divided into different floors, with younger children on the first floor, older students on the second, and the teachers' rooms above. The school even had an attic, where the narrator remembers spending time, although the exact reason for being there eludes them now. The school was run by a peculiar family, starting with the principal, Mrs. Howe. She bore a striking resemblance to the late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, at least in the narrator's mind, which may reflect the sense of formality and control she exuded. Her husband, Mr. Howe, was described as a tall and lanky man with thinning hair and watery eyes. He wasn't much of a teacher, but instead he appeared to play a more administrative role in the school, often mumbling and stuttering when speaking, especially when he was angry. His presence was intimidating, but not in a typical authoritative way. It was more like he gave off an aura of discomfort, which made the students uneasy around him. The Howe family had 3 children. One of them, whom the narrator refers to as Wally, was in their class. Wally was a special needs student, often clumsy and prone to accidents, which would cause him to make loud noises when he hurt himself. The other 2 children were a high school-aged goth girl who was somewhat distant and occasionally present during school events, and the oldest son, Dom. Dom was an adult, having recently returned from college in his early 20s, and was always present at the school. Although he didn't hold any official teaching position, Dom seemed to be around constantly. His presence was strange and unsettling, especially for a young child, as he would be seen at events like sports days, Christmas festivals, and bake sales. Looking back, the narrator now finds this odd, but as a child, they didn't fully comprehend how unusual it was to have the principal's adult son lurking around the school. What made this experience even more uncomfortable was the school's pool. Located just past the school's playground and hidden by trees, the outdoor pool was a source of intrigue. However, it was an area that the children weren't allowed near initially. The pool had been left uncovered and filled with debris, such as leaves and branches. It was unsafe, and the students were warned not to go near it. Eventually, during the summer of their second year at the school, the pool was cleaned and the students were given access to it. There was an initial excitement among the children, especially since they were finally allowed to swim and use the pool. However, the pool itself had inadequate changing facilities, which were described as small, old shacks under the trees. The dressing rooms were poorly maintained, with splintery wooden benches and insects crawling around. Despite this, swimming lessons were scheduled, and students were expected to use the pool for their lessons and recreational activities. The narrator recalls that the changing rooms were so poorly kept that many students, rather than changing inside, would often wear their swimsuits to school under their clothes. This way, they could avoid spending time in the unkempt dressing rooms. In addition to these unsanitary conditions, there was a strict rule against locking any doors in the school, a policy established after a student had been accidentally locked in a bathroom stall for an entire lunch break. Rather than fixing the issue, the school had decided that no doors should be locked. This left the dressing rooms open and accessible to anyone who wandered in, including the strange and unsettling presence of Dom, the principal's son. Dom had a peculiar habit of bursting into the boys' dressing rooms, making a game of it by shouting, "Boo!" as a joke. This behavior made the students uncomfortable, but they had little recourse since Dom was the principal's son and technically had the authority. The narrator recalls a particular incident when they were alone in the boys' changing room, about to get dressed for a swimming lesson. It was a hot day, and the narrator was already feeling uneasy when Dom entered, as he often did. This time, he didn't just yell "boo" and leave. Instead, he stood there watching the narrator with his arms crossed. He held the narrator's swim trunks in front of them, which made the narrator feel deeply uncomfortable. The narrator had no choice but to quickly turn their back to Dom to change, feeling a cold sensation of unease deep in their stomach. What followed was even worse. Dom, standing behind the narrator, unexpectedly grabbed their shoulders, sending a shock of discomfort through the narrator's body. They were frightened and hurt, and this encounter left them feeling physically and emotionally violated. As the situation escalated, Dom tripped backward into a wall, knocking something loose from the rafters above. It turned out that the ceiling held a wasp nest, which had been disturbed by Dom's fall. A swarm of angry wasps emerged from the nest and began attacking Dom, who screamed in terror and rushed toward the door. In the chaos, Dom locked the door behind him, trapping both him and the narrator in the dressing room. The narrator was terrified, crying, but eventually the door was opened, and Dom fled, leaving the narrator to deal with the aftermath of the wasp attack. The incident was chaotic and left the narrator feeling shaken and fearful. Dom's behavior had escalated to a point where it was no longer just strange, it was disturbing. The experience would remain with the narrator for a long time, and the sense of dread about the strange atmosphere at the school only deepened. The story of Dom's behavior at the school became a cautionary tale, illustrating the dangers of unchecked power and the unsettling presence of someone who should have never been in such close proximity to the students. The narrative begins with the recounting of a terrifying encounter that the narrator had during a pool party with friends in their backyard. The setting is a warm summer evening, where the group of young women, all in their early 20s, are enjoying a relaxing time in an above-ground pool. The mood is light and carefree, with cocktails in hand and music playing in the background. The evening is perfect, with the sun setting over the forest behind their suburban house, and everything seems to be peaceful. This sense of calm is abruptly shattered when three unfamiliar men walk into the yard through the back gate. The men seem confident and casual, as if they have a right to be there, and they immediately draw the attention of the group. The narrator and her friends are unsure of who they are, but they sense something is off about the situation. The men introduce themselves as Chad, Brad, and Vlad, and claim they are looking for one of the women, Janet, who is not present. They suggest that Janet owes them money, which immediately raises suspicion. The women are confused, as Janet is known to be a sensible person who doesn't owe anyone anything. The three men, however, continue to hang around the pool, making the group of women feel increasingly uncomfortable. The situation quickly escalates as Chad, the leader of the group, becomes more aggressive in his behavior. He makes inappropriate remarks and starts trying to dunk one of the women, Claire, who is clearly not enjoying the attention. This behavior is a warning sign that the situation is no longer just awkward, it is turning dangerous. As the tension rises, Dana, one of the women, demands that the men leave. However, before they can do anything, Vlad, one of the men, moves swiftly and shoves Dana back into the pool. This act of aggression immediately shifts the atmosphere from uncomfortable to frightening. The narrator realizes they are no longer in control of the situation. The men are not just being rude, they are now making threats. Chad pulls out a switchblade, a small but sharp knife, and begins to threaten the women with it. The mood shifts dramatically, and the women who were once carefree are now trapped in the pool with these men circling around them, making them feel helpless and vulnerable. Chad, Brad, and Vlad start to make demands, saying that they want the money Janet owes them, or the women will have to pay in another way. The situation becomes even more alarming when they suggest that the women could pay the debt on behalf of their friend Janet. The narrator, still in the pool, tries to remain calm, but the threat of violence is very real. The men, showing no signs of leaving, continue to pressure them for money. They claim that Janet owes them a substantial amount, $5,000, which seems an outrageous sum for anyone to owe, especially someone like Janet. The narrator realizes the men are likely drug dealers or involved in illegal activities, as they mention that they are involved with substances like coke and MDMA. This revelation makes the situation even more dire, as the women realize they are dealing with people who may not hesitate to hurt them if things don't go their way. Things take an even more dangerous turn when Vlad, who had been silent until this point, grabs Claire by the hair, yanking her out of the pool. She screams in pain, and the terror among the women reaches a peak. In that moment, they are all at the mercy of these men, and the narrator knows that they have to act quickly or risk being seriously hurt. In a split second, Kelly, who has been relatively quiet throughout this ordeal, comes up with a plan. She decides to call Pete, a guy she had been seeing, to help. However, in an effort to stop her, Chad grabs Kelly and forces her to go inside to call Pete. The narrator, along with the others, watches helplessly as Kelly is escorted away by Chad, Brad, and Vlad. The narrator, feeling the weight of the situation, watches in horror as Kelly rushes inside the house to make the call. Just as things seem to reach their breaking point, a stroke of luck occurs. Kelly, in a desperate act, grabs a lamp from the table inside the house and smashes it into Chad's face. The blow is enough to disorient him, and he stumbles back, creating an opportunity for the women to fight back. Kelly's courage in that moment inspires the other women to act. They quickly grab anything they can find, and Donna in particular uses a golf club to defend herself and the others. She strikes Brad in the forearm, managing to crack it in the process. Chad, now injured and panicking, bolts for the back gate with Brad close behind him. The situation is chaotic, but the women manage to keep their wits about them long enough to make a stand. As they call for help, their neighbors, who have been listening to the commotion, finally rush over. One of the men in the neighborhood, an off-duty cop, tackles Vlad, who had been standing there, dumbfounded by the events unfolding around him. The authorities are called, and the three men are taken away. The women are left shaken, but they are alive and safe. Afterward, the police speak with Pete, who denies owing the men any money, but he is able to identify them. The women try to press charges for assault, but the case ends up being settled out of court. The families of the men, who were embarrassed by their son's actions, manage to avoid jail time, though the men face consequences such as expulsion from school and probation. The women, particularly the narrator, feel a sense of closure but also deep frustration that the men did not face harsher penalties for their actions. Despite this, they take comfort in the fact that they were able to defend themselves, and the incident serves as a stark reminder of the dangers that can emerge unexpectedly. In the years that follow, the women move on with their lives. The narrator, now older, reflects on the traumatic event but is thankful for the way they were able to protect themselves and each other. The experience leaves them with a sense of strength, knowing they survived an encounter with men who had sinister intentions. The narrator continues to value the friendships formed during that time and remains close with Kelly, who eventually married Pete. The incident remains a defining moment in their lives, and it's a reminder of how quickly things can change and how important it is to be vigilant and prepared in the face of danger. The story begins with the narrator recalling an unsettling and highly unusual experience from their childhood. The setting is a primary school located in a small suburban area in England, where the narrator first met their best friend, Clarky. The two were inseparable from the beginning, forming a bond that transcended the ordinary friendship. Together, they navigated the ups and downs of primary school life. Though they were generally seen as popular and well-liked by their peers, they had their share of trouble, usually of a harmless nature. However, everything began to change when they transitioned to secondary school. In England, the transition from primary to secondary school is a significant one, often involving a drastic change in the size of the school and the student body. It is during this shift that the narrator and Clarky's lives took a dark turn. The secondary school they entered was much larger and more intimidating than their primary school. They went from being the big fish in a small pond to feeling small and insignificant among older, more mature students. The transition was jarring, and both of them struggled to adjust. They had assumed that they would be placed in the same classes, surrounded by the familiar faces from their primary school, but the school administration had different plans. They were placed in separate classes and separated into different houses, making it harder for them to stick together. Suddenly, they were alone in an environment full of strangers, facing a much more challenging social landscape. As a result, they both became unpopular and isolated, often finding themselves targets for bullying. The bullying started off as typical schoolyard taunts, but soon escalated to physical aggression. There were two main bullies, Jake and Jonah, who relentlessly picked on the narrator and Clarky. These bullies were older, bigger, and had a group of friends who took part in tormenting them. The bullying was cruel and unrelenting. Jake and Jonah would insult them, shove them in the hallways, and even destroy their belongings. It wasn't just the verbal abuse that was hard to bear, but the physical intimidation as well. The pain was compounded by the fact that no one seemed to notice the extent of the bullying. Neither the narrator nor Clarky felt comfortable speaking up about their tormentors, as snitching was seen as a form of weakness. The sense of powerlessness and fear began to dominate their school life, turning every day into a battle of survival. One of the key moments in the narrator's story involves a school swimming lesson that took place during the summer term. After a long year of torment, the chance to have swimming lessons seemed like a welcome distraction. The boys and girls were split into different groups, and it was during these lessons that the narrator and Clarky finally had some time to spend together. However, even this seemingly simple activity became a source of anxiety. The bullying did not stop just because they were in the pool. In fact, it took on a more insidious form. Jake and Jonah, two of the main bullies, showed up in the changing rooms, fully dressed in their school uniforms, which was highly unusual. Their presence in the pool area made the narrator and Clarky feel increasingly uncomfortable. The two bullies began to taunt them, making cruel remarks and creating an atmosphere of hostility. The narrator and Clarky were on edge the entire time. As the bullying continued to escalate, the narrator and Clarky decided to sneak back into the pool after everyone else had left. They had grown used to being on their own, away from the prying eyes of their peers, and this moment seemed like one of the few chances they had to enjoy something carefree. They jumped into the pool and started to swim, but their fleeting sense of freedom was quickly shattered when Jake and Jonah entered the area. The tension in the air was palpable as the bullies began to circle the two friends, heightening the sense of danger. What was initially harmless fun quickly became a terrifying ordeal. The situation turned even worse when Jonah, one of the bullies, found an old drainage grate by the side of the pool. In a twisted act of cruelty, he dared Clarky to stick his head into the hole, as if it were some sort of joke. Despite the narrator's protests, Clarky, who was much smaller than the narrator, reluctantly leaned over the hole. Jonah then shoved the grate down, trapping Clarky's head in the drainage hole. As Clarky struggled to free himself, the narrator's heart pounded with fear. The moment felt like an eternity. The narrator shouted for Jonah to stop, but it was too late. The horrible sound of Clarky's neck snapping echoed in the pool area as he flailed, trying to free himself. In that instant, the narrator realized that their best friend was no longer alive. The events that followed were chaotic. The bullies, clearly shocked by what they had done, ran away, leaving the narrator alone with Clarky. The narrator was paralyzed with grief and fear, cradling their best friend's lifeless body. The arrival of the PE teacher and other school staff only made the situation more complicated, as the narrator had to decide whether to tell the truth about Jonah's role in the tragedy. Ultimately, the narrator chose to cover for Jonah, believing that his life would be ruined if the truth came out. In the end, the incident was chalked up to an accident, and the bullies were not held accountable for their actions. Years later, the narrator reflects on the devastating consequences of that day. The pain of losing Clarky has never fully healed, and the guilt of not speaking out weighs heavily on them. However, the experience also taught the narrator valuable lessons about the cruelty of bullying, the need to stand up for what is right, and the importance of speaking out against injustice. The bullies, Jake and Jonah, may have escaped serious consequences, but their actions would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the end, the narrator is left with the memory of their best friend, Clarky, and the painful realization that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not just the loss of a loved one, but the silence that follows. In the early 1990s, the narrator attended a unique charter school in Minnesota that was housed in a converted mansion. Though the narrator was only 5 years old at the time, they recall the damp, musty atmosphere of the school vividly. The building, which had been adapted for educational purposes, was small, and the school catered to a relatively small number of students. The younger children, including the narrator, were assigned classrooms on the first floor, while the older students were assigned to the upper floors, including the attic. This building arrangement would later become important in the narrator's unsettling experience at the school. The school was led by a principal, Mrs. Howe, whose appearance was strikingly similar to that of the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Ms. Howe ran the school with an iron fist, though she occasionally displayed kindness, especially toward the narrator, giving them a Christmas present once. The principal's husband, Mr. Howe, was a mysterious figure. He was tall, lanky, and not really a teacher. Instead, he was involved in some kind of business. Though the narrator couldn't quite understand his exact role in the school, he was often around and his presence made the narrator and the other students uncomfortable. Despite his unremarkable demeanor, he had a certain strange aura about him that the children couldn't quite place. The Howe family also had 3 children. One of them, Wally, was in the same class as the narrator. Wally was a special needs child, always clumsy and prone to accidents. His constant accidents often caused a scene, with desks and chairs being knocked over whenever he entered a room. The middle child was a typical 90s goth girl, who was often seen around the school but was somewhat distant and disinterested. However, it was the eldest son, Dom, who was the most notable figure at the school. Dom, in his early 20s, had just returned from college and seemed to have taken up a strange and unsettling role in the school. Unlike other adult figures in the school, Dom was often seen lurking around the playground during sports days and other school events. He wasn't a teacher, but he was around all the time, and his looming presence made the younger students uncomfortable. Looking back, the narrator realizes that his constant presence at the school was highly unusual. As a child, they didn't question it, but as they grew older, they began to see just how strange it was for an adult to be so frequently around a school where he had no direct responsibilities. Things took a turn for the worse when the school began using the swimming pool. The pool was located on the outskirts of the school grounds, surrounded by trees, making it seem like a secluded, tranquil space. Initially, the students were not allowed to use the pool as it was uncovered and filled with debris. However, as the school year progressed, the pool was cleaned and made accessible for swimming lessons. While the students were excited about the new addition to their activities, the atmosphere surrounding the pool quickly turned ominous. The pool area was not the luxurious facility one might expect from an expensive charter school. Instead, it consisted of 2 small, run-down changing rooms situated under the tree line. The rooms were old, filled with splintering wooden benches, and were often covered in spiders and other insects. Despite the school's high tuition fees, the upkeep of the changing rooms was clearly neglected. In fact, the pool had become somewhat of a taboo for the students, with strict warnings not to go near it when it was in disrepair. Yet, when it was finally cleaned and opened, the excitement quickly faded as students realized that the changing rooms were in such a poor state. An odd rule at the school was that students were not allowed to lock any doors, including those in the changing rooms. This rule stemmed from an incident in which a student had accidentally locked themselves in a bathroom stall and had a panic attack. As a result, the school decided that no doors could be locked, creating a sense of vulnerability among the students. This was particularly relevant to the narrator's experience when Dom, the principal's son, began to enter the changing rooms while students were undressed. At first, it seemed harmless, as Dom would often burst into the room shouting, "Boo!" to startle the kids, and everyone would laugh it off. However, as time passed, the narrator started feeling increasingly uncomfortable with Dom's actions. One particular incident stands out in the narrator's memory. It was a hot summer day, and the narrator was taking their time getting dressed for swimming. Most of the other students had already changed and gone into the pool. The narrator, still struggling to change, was alone in the changing room when Dom entered, despite there being no reason for him to do so. This time, Dom's voice was quieter than usual as he entered, and he told the narrator to hurry up. Instead of leaving as expected, Dom shut the door behind him and stood watching the narrator, who felt an overwhelming sense of fear and unease. The narrator had no choice but to change in front of him, feeling a coldness in their stomach as Dom stood there, staring at them. What happened next would leave a lasting scar in the narrator's memory. As the narrator turned their back to Dom to change, Dom suddenly grabbed their shoulders. The feeling of his touch sent waves of terror through the narrator. In a panic, the narrator stumbled backward and fell onto a splintering bench, causing a sharp pain in their legs. They began crying from both the pain and fear, which only seemed to anger Dom further. He chastised them for crying, calling them a baby, and pulled the narrator to their feet in a forceful manner. The narrator, terrified, wondered if Dom was about to punish them in some way. In a moment of chaos, Dom stumbled backward and knocked into the wall of the changing room, accidentally knocking a wasp nest from the rafters. Within moments, a swarm of angry wasps descended upon the room, and Dom fled in a panic, leaving the narrator behind in a cloud of stinging insects. The incident caused chaos, with teachers scrambling to remove the wasps and the students running for safety. Dom, still swatting at the wasps, caused more disruption, but the narrator finally managed to escape the ordeal. However, the lingering unease and fear remained. The story concludes with the narrator's escape from the unsettling environment of the school. They were eventually moved to a different school, though they never fully understood why the change occurred at the time. It was only later that the narrator learned the truth. The school, led by the Howe family, was involved in fraudulent activities and was under investigation for embezzlement. Dom, the principal's son, was later sent to prison for unrelated crimes, adding to the disturbing nature of the entire situation. In the late summer, when the narrator was a 21-year-old college student on the cusp of finishing up before entering med school, they and their friends decided to unwind and throw a small pool party at their shared house. It was around 10 p.m., and the mood was light, with drinks flowing and the warm summer air surrounding the backyard. The smell of barbecue from the Petersons' house next door mingled with the sound of fading children's laughter, creating a relaxed atmosphere. The group of 4 girls, all in their 20s, had been drinking for about an hour, and they were enjoying the calm after what had been a difficult year filled with studying, work, and personal struggles. The evening had been perfect: cool drinks, good music, and the peace that comes with a summer evening in the suburbs. As the music played, the group was basking in the rare moment of joy and relaxation before the weight of the next phase of their lives. But, as often happens when one least expects it, trouble was about to come knocking. Without warning, the back gate to their property opened, and 3 men strolled into the yard. At first, it didn't seem like a cause for concern. The girls were used to people dropping by unannounced, especially if they could hear music playing in the backyard. It could have been Janet's boyfriend or one of the other people they knew, but something about these 3 men didn't feel right. They were college-age, and they walked into the yard with a confidence that didn't sit well with the girls. None of them recognized the men, but their demeanor was off, predatory even. The leader of the group, a man named Chad, gave off an almost wolfish grin, which immediately set off alarm bells for the girls. His behavior wasn't normal. When Dana asked who they were, Chad grinned wider, suggesting that they had just dropped by to hang out. Despite the casual tone, there was an unsettling undercurrent to their presence. They weren't here to enchant a friendly evening, but to intimidate. This feeling grew as the conversation continued. Kelly, one of the girls, asked if they were looking for Janet, but Chad, after a brief exchange with his friends, quickly claimed that Janet owed them money. It was a strange claim. Janet was sensible and responsible, and none of the girls had any idea what they were talking about. When asked how much Janet owed them, Chad said that it was a significant amount, $5,000, money that none of them had, nor had any idea why Janet would owe such an enormous sum. The tension in the air grew thick. Kelly, trying to brush off the men's bizarre accusations, told them that Janet wasn't home and wouldn't be back soon. But Chad wasn't letting it go. He hinted that if the girls couldn't get Janet to pay up, perhaps they could settle the score themselves. The girls were caught in an increasingly uncomfortable situation, unsure of what these men might do next. Things escalated quickly. Vlad, one of the men, silently moved to the side of the pool and lifted the ladder that provided the only way out. The girls, already nervous, realized that this was not a random visit. It was part of a plan to intimidate them, perhaps even trap them. When Chad grabbed Kelly's arm and pulled her toward the back door, the situation became much more dangerous. The girls began to panic as Chad's actions grew more aggressive. Just as Kelly tried to escape, a commotion erupted. Kelly grabbed a lamp from inside the house and smashed it into Chad's face, sending him reeling. Blood began to pour down his face, and he stumbled backward, falling over a patio chair. This moment of chaos was a turning point for the girls. Kelly, seizing the opportunity, ran back into the yard, calling for help at the top of her lungs. The other girls followed suit, desperately hoping someone would hear their cries. The sound of Kelly's screams drew the attention of the neighbors, and soon, a couple of men, including Mr. Peterson, came rushing into the yard to help. As the situation unfolded, one of the off-duty cops, a neighbor who had been alerted to the disturbance, quickly acted. The girls' attackers were momentarily distracted, allowing the men to overpower Vlad, who had been standing idly by. He was pinned to the ground and the police were called. Meanwhile, Chad and the others fled through the back gate, disappearing into the night. The police soon arrived and took control of the situation. They spoke with Pete, the man connected to the group's accusation about the debt. Pete denied knowing anything about the situation, but the girls provided descriptions of the attackers, who turned out to be fellow college students. The authorities attempted to press charges, but because the only injuries were to Chad and Brad, the case became complicated. In the end, the families of the attackers settled out of court, which did little to provide the closure the girls had hoped for. Despite the legal proceedings, the girls were left with an unsettling feeling about the whole situation. They had been in real danger, and the fear lingered in their minds. It was a terrible experience, but one that also taught them a valuable lesson about trust and vigilance. It was a reminder that even in a seemingly safe environment, danger could lurk just around the corner. In the aftermath, the girls stayed in the house for a little while longer, but the events of that night changed them. Kelly and Pete, despite everything, stayed together and eventually married. The rest of the group drifted apart, but the bond between them remained, albeit shaken. The girls, forever scarred by the experience, found a sense of closure in knowing that justice had been served, even if it wasn't the ideal outcome. The girls' terrifying ordeal that summer night, though frightening, ended with them emerging stronger, and they learned to never take their safety for granted again. It was an experience they would carry with them forever, one that defined their growth from that point onward. The early 90s were a time of new experiences and fresh starts for many people, and one particular story highlights the unsettling side of life at a charter school in Minnesota. The narrator was a young child at the time, around 5 years old, attending a small school that had recently opened in a converted mansion. Although they were just a small part of the new student body, their experience would leave a lasting impression on them as they grew older. At first, everything seemed exciting. The school had been freshly converted, and the classrooms were located in different parts of the mansion. The youngest students, like the narrator, were on the first floor, while the older kids had classrooms upstairs. The school even had an attic that the narrator remembers visiting once or twice. The school, though, felt damp and musty, a stark contrast to the excitement they had when first walking into it. The principal, Mrs. Howe, was an imposing figure. She resembled the old British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, an authority figure in every sense. Her husband, Mr. Howe, was a much stranger presence, a tall and lanky man who would occasionally teach the younger students, though he was clearly not a professional teacher. He had an odd, disconcerting air about him, often mumbling and stuttering, but when he got angry, his demeanor could change dramatically, becoming frightening. The Howe family's home life was equally peculiar. They had 3 children, each of whom seemed to have their quirks. The youngest child, whom the narrator calls Wally, was a clumsy and happy child with special needs, prone to accidents that would send him into fits of tears. The middle child, a high schooler, was an aloof goth who only appeared at the school sporadically. The oldest child, Dom, was in his early 20s and had returned to live with his parents after graduating from college. He seemed to be hanging around the school all the time, often attending events like sports days and bake sales, but his presence never seemed entirely appropriate. The narrator didn't think much of it as a young child, but as they grew older, they would look back and recognize just how odd it was for an adult to be so involved in a school meant for younger children. The school also had a pool, an outdoor one surrounded by trees and placed just a short walk from the playground. The pool, however, wasn't used initially. It had been left uncovered and filled with leaves, twigs, and insects. The school had a rule that kids weren't allowed to go near it for safety reasons. This pool became a point of fascination and excitement for the kids when they finally learned that it was being cleaned and could be used the following year. Once the pool was ready, the children were allowed to use it. However, it came with its own set of problems. The changing rooms, which were old wooden shacks hidden under the trees, were hardly up to standard. They were dusty, full of insects, and the benches had splinters. Despite being a relatively expensive charter school, there was little spent on maintaining the pool or the changing rooms. The kids were often told to wear their swimsuits under their clothes so they could change quickly and get into the pool, avoiding spending too much time in the changing rooms. An odd rule in the school was that no doors could ever be locked. This was due to a previous incident in which a student had locked themselves in a bathroom stall and had a panic attack. Instead of fixing the locks, the school simply decided that no doors could be locked, a decision that would later have consequences. This brings us to a particularly disturbing incident involving Dom, the oldest child of the principal. Dom was often present around the school, and while he was an adult, he wasn't really a teacher. He was simply there, sometimes overseeing students, though his behavior was increasingly inappropriate. On one occasion, when the narrator was in the changing room preparing for swimming class, Dom entered unexpectedly, making a joke about scaring them by saying "boo." It seemed harmless at first, but there was something unsettling about his presence. Dom didn't leave immediately, despite the narrator's discomfort. Instead, he stood there watching the child change, making them feel uneasy and trapped. This incident was one of many, but it left the narrator feeling vulnerable and frightened, an emotion they hadn't fully processed at the time. Things took a more sinister turn when Dom followed the narrator into the changing room and physically grabbed their shoulders. The narrator, overwhelmed by fear, ended up falling backward, hitting a bench, and crying out of sheer panic and confusion. This moment was terrifying for the narrator, as Dom's actions felt more like intimidation than a harmless prank. The situation escalated further when, in the midst of the confrontation, a wasp nest in the ceiling was disturbed, sending a cloud of wasps into the room. Dom, in a panic, shoved the narrator aside and fled, leaving them alone in the chaos of buzzing wasps. The physical and emotional consequences of that moment lingered for a long time. After the wasp attack, the narrator left the school soon after, though the reasons for the move were never explicitly discussed. Later on, it was revealed that the school was operating under dubious circumstances. The Howe family, it turned out, was involved in tax fraud, running a school that received charter funding and tuition fees while neglecting the safety and welfare of the students. The story took another turn when Dom, in his 40s, was arrested for unrelated crimes, including abusing children. The narrator, reflecting on their time at the school, was grateful for having escaped that situation, but felt deeply disturbed by what had happened behind the scenes. In the end, the narrator's experiences at the school, while unsettling and strange, led to a greater understanding of the hidden dangers in seemingly safe environments. The story highlights the importance of vigilance and the recognition of inappropriate behavior, particularly when it's tied to those in positions of power or authority. The disturbing actions of Dom, though seemingly harmless at first, were far more sinister in hindsight, leaving the narrator to wonder how many other children might have been affected by the negligence and misconduct that was allowed to persist. In the world of educational systems, charter schools often stand out for their promise of individualized attention and innovative approaches. However, not all experiences at these schools are as rosy as they appear on the surface. The narrator's experience at a charter school in the early 90s provides a disturbing example of how things can go wrong, especially when the people entrusted with caring for children have questionable motives and behavior. The story begins with the narrator being just 5 years old, attending a newly opened charter school located in a converted mansion. The school was small, with the younger students on the first floor and older students above them. The atmosphere in the school was damp and musty, far from the ideal learning environment one might expect. As the narrator recounts their memories, the image of the school, despite its promise, was far less appealing in reality. The principal of the school, Mrs. Howe, made a significant impression on the students. She was an imposing figure, reminiscent of a British political figure, Margaret Thatcher. Mrs. Howe's husband, Mr. Howe, also played a role in the school, although it was less clear what his specific duties were. He wasn't a teacher by profession, but would occasionally step in to teach. His behavior was odd. Tall and lanky, he would often mumble or stutter, and when he became angry, his rage was terrifying. Despite his strange presence, the students were expected to respect him due to his position within the school. The Howe family's own children were also a part of the school experience. Their youngest child, whom the narrator refers to as Wally, had special needs and was prone to accidents. He was always happy, but his clumsiness led to many mishaps. The middle child, a high schooler, was a typical 90s goth, appearing at the school only sporadically. The oldest child, Dom, was the one whose actions would ultimately leave a lasting impact on the narrator. Dom was in his early 20s and seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time at the school, a presence that seemed increasingly inappropriate as the narrator grew older. One of the features of the school that the children were excited about was the outdoor pool surrounded by trees. The pool had been left uncovered for a long time, filled with debris and insects. For safety reasons, the children weren't allowed near it. However, when the school finally decided to clean the pool, the students were thrilled to use it. Despite the excitement, the changing rooms were in a terrible condition, falling far below acceptable standards. The wooden benches were splintered, and there were insects everywhere. The school, despite being fairly expensive, did little to maintain the facilities, including the pool and the changing rooms. As a result, many students, including the narrator, would often wear their swimsuits to school underneath their clothes so they could avoid spending too much time in the unsanitary dressing rooms. A significant detail of the school was the rule that no doors could be locked. This rule was a reaction to a previous incident in which a student had locked themselves in a bathroom stall, resulting in a panic attack. Instead of fixing those locks, the school decided that no doors should be locked under any circumstances. This seemingly innocuous rule would have dire consequences for the narrator. Dom's behavior at the school began to raise alarms. He was an adult who was always around, but he wasn't a teacher or in a position of authority, which made his constant presence all the more concerning. Dom's behavior was inappropriate from the start. He would often barge into the changing rooms while students were changing, making it seem like a harmless prank. But as the narrator reflects, there was always something unsettling about his actions. On one particular occasion, Dom entered the changing room while the narrator was alone, making a joke by shouting, "Boo!" The narrator, already uncomfortable with his presence, was taken aback but didn't feel they could speak up. Dom didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood there, watching the narrator change, creating a sense of vulnerability and fear. Things escalated when Dom physically grabbed the narrator's shoulders in the changing room. The narrator, overwhelmed with fear, fell back onto a splintered bench, causing pain and panic. This confrontation was made even worse when, in the chaos, a wasp nest was disturbed, releasing a swarm of wasps. Dom, in a panicked frenzy, shoved the narrator aside and ran out of the room, leaving them alone to deal with the swarm. The emotional and physical toll of this incident was not something the narrator could easily forget. This incident was one of many that left the narrator feeling unsettled and fearful at the school. Later on, they would learn that the Howe family was involved in illegal activities, running a school that received charter funding while cutting corners in maintenance and student safety. The situation became even more disturbing when Dom, in his 40s, was arrested for crimes unrelated to his behavior at the school. It was revealed that Dom had abused children, further highlighting the danger he posed during his time at the school. The narrator's experience at the school, despite being a small part of their childhood, shaped their understanding of power dynamics, inappropriate behavior, and the hidden dangers that can exist in seemingly safe environments. The Howe family, despite their public position, had failed to protect the students under their care, and their negligence had far-reaching consequences. The experience ultimately served as a wake-up call for the narrator, one that would stay with them for the rest of their life. Looking back, the narrator is grateful for the escape they had from the school, but they continue to reflect on the missed opportunities to speak up and the danger that lurked behind the facade of authority. It is a story that serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need to trust one's instincts when something feels wrong. Even in places where safety should be guaranteed, there are times when hidden dangers can pose a real threat.